All right, welcome to another Center for Agricultural Profitability webinar from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Dr. Elliott Dennis. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, and I'm a livestock economist with the Center for Agricultural Profitability. Today, we're excited to offer a webinar designed for consumers who are interested in purchasing meat directly from local producers. But this webinar is part of a larger webinar series, which the Center for Agricultural Profitability has been hosting each Thursday from 12 to noon Central Daylight Time. We do have a schedule of upcoming webinars, as well as an archive of all of our past webinars from 2019 till today at the center's website, which is cap.unl.edu. So if you're interested, go over there and check that out. But in today's webinar, we're going to be covering everything from understanding how meat is priced, some common labeling terms, and estimating how much meat you'll receive when buying bulk from producers. We're going to discuss what questions to ask, what the meat processing process, and what delivery typically works. So whether you're new to buying local meat or you're just looking for some more guidance, we hope this webinar will provide some practical insights for you. We do ask that if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A chat or the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll get them during the webinar or at the end of the webinar. Joining me today to present is Dr. Gary Sullivan, who's a professor of meat science here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Sullivan helps run the meat processing lab here, has a specialty in further meat processing, and is really geared towards food quality, safety, shelf life of value-added processed meat. So he'll be joining and welcome him in the presentation. So really what we want to talk about today is if we're thinking about buying local meat, what are kind of those steps that we need to go through? So we've often heard about kind of local meat and kind of where to buy this. Probably most commonly, we think about farmers markets or kind of walking amongst producers and saying, okay, this is your farm, do you buy the meat? But there's also this larger push to say, okay, how do we keep local dollars within the local community that gets reinvested and kind of circulated? And this has really been a larger push for the last 20 or 30 years. But really what brought kind of the rise to local meat was COVID. COVID was kind of a big shift. All of a sudden, there was disruptions in the national meat supply chain. And so a lot of people kind of were looking for meat to put in their freezers, and local meat processing kind of became that highlight. So if you've heard a lot of that, that's generally why it's been a big push. But this larger push has been around for quite a bit. But before you actually were thinking about, okay, we're going to buy certain meats, or how do I find meat processors, we kind of wanted to just set the base of like, what do these terms actually mean so that we're understanding and we're on the same page. So real quick, what do you know about where these eggs came from? This would be like a typical thing that you'd maybe buy in Hy-Vee or Super Saver or Sam's Club, wherever you buy. You have this box that has labels on it. What do we know about this? Well, for one thing, sometimes labels, while they're on there, they can be, I'd say, a little bit misleading. So if you see this, it says no added hormones, and then it says see inside lid. But we actually know that federal regulations have never permitted hormones or steroids in poultry, pork, or goat. So there's an example of, yes, it does have no added hormones, but maybe there's not a full understanding of that production process. We don't know kind of what farm that was from. And so for people who are interested in that, buying local tends to matter. So we hear a lot of these different phrases. We hear what's natural, what's grass-fed, what's organic. And the newest kind of word is pasture-raised or free-range, generally in poultry, and then of course humane handling. So on the right-hand side are just some labels. This is not comprehensive of every label that's out there, but just a few to kind of give you an idea of that. Not only do we have these claims, but then we try to label them. So what is natural? Sometimes you'll hear this is natural beef or this is natural lamb. And this is separate from the animal versus the meat. So when we talk about the animal, when we say this is a natural steer, generally what we're meaning is that it's raised without antibiotics or hormones or hormone implants throughout its entire life. So typically hormones would be given if they're put into an animal feeding operation. If an animal gets sick, right, we need humanely treat it, and so it's given antibiotics just like us when we're sick. And so if the animal is given antibiotics or hormones throughout its life, it can't be actually certified as natural. And there's a difference between someone saying my animal is natural versus it actually has a label and verified that it is natural. And so generally on the labeling, someone has to come out and they have to, a third party person, they have to verify it, and the producer pays essentially to get that certification. So what is grass-fed? So we've heard of like this big push towards saying we need to eat grass-fed beef, and people have their preferences in that. But sometimes it generally just implies that it has a grass-fed diet. It doesn't mean it's 100% or strictly grass-fed. So sometimes you'll hear these types of claims out there. It's grass-fed or grass-finished, grass through its entire life. But just for perspective, all cattle are raised on grass at some point during their life. And in fact, if you think about all the forage that they eat from the time that they're born to the time that they're actually harvested, 85% of actually all the feed that they use is actually forage or grass, and it's not grain finished. So different kind of labels and different meanings for grass or what is grass-fed. So another label that started in the early 2000s was organic, and actually USDA came out and said this is what an organic product is. And they basically said you have to have organic feed, so if you're feeding grain, it has to be organic grain. You have to have certain housing regulations. The facility has to be certified organic, and you can't use any hormones or implants. And so that does provide certain kind of assurances to the consumers, but the question is, could this be a certified organic farm? And the answer is yes, it could be. And so sometimes there's this misconception of like what I think an organic farm looks like to what it actually might be. And so once again, kind of having that relationship between the producer and the consumer. Another one that we started to see is pasture or free range. And really all that pasture or free range means is that they have access to the outdoors. And in some states, there's certain regulations about space requirements. And so if we see pastured eggs or free range eggs, it's generally mean that they have access to outdoors. Doesn't indicate for how long or how much space they have, but just that they have access to the outdoors. So could this animal be pastured or free range? It probably could, right? So just once again, if we're thinking about types of operations, just because it's pastured may not be the operation that you want to purchase from. So the big one is about eggs. We've seen there's been a lot of discussion, especially in California, if you've heard about battery cages. This is a typical large-scale egg-laying operation, and where hens are in cages and the eggs fall down and they're collected. This would be a cage-free, large-scale egg-laying operation, so where chickens or hens can kind of roam around. They're not in cages, and they can eat, but generally in a specified space. This would be a large-scale free-range egg-laying operation. So notice they have kind of access to the outside where they can come in and out, but they lay their eggs. And then this would be a small-scale pasture raised egg-laying operation. So eggs, pasture, free range can really vary. And if you look at prices, generally those are different prices depending upon at the retail store. Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about, what is the difference? So I kind of went through, this is on the livestock side, but once the animal is harvested, then certain labels can be assigned to the meat itself once it's been harvested.
Yeah, so there are a couple of religious related labels that you'll find on meat products. Halal or kosher are the two that are people are most common with, and you'll see these, and they have a set of criteria that they must follow as they're going through the processing of the animal, and both halal and kosher have authorities that will provide that claim that goes along with it, or the ability to put it on there. A natural claim from a USDA on a product standpoint is really just saying what has been added. There's no artificial ingredients or color or minimally processed. And so if you think of it from a standpoint, all fresh meat in this case would be considered natural. And as Elliott mentioned, the raising claims are different than natural itself. And so it depends what's going on with that and how it's labeled. So another thing that you'll find in the processors is a lot of the small processors will talk about how long they'll hang their products in the cooler. And this is dry aging technically, where the picture on the right that you see is more of what people typically think on of a dry aging of a cut, or if you see that marketed. And so a couple of things that happened as that animal hangs, and specifically when we're working with beef, is you get an improvement in tenderness. And so we get an improvement that occurs. Most of it will happen by days 7 to 10. A lot of small processors will allow hanging of up to 14 days without extra cost. If you want to go longer and people think that that's what they want, there's an added fee that goes along with it. That's with it. One thing with dry aging is there's a lot of research that's done looking at whether you just concentrate the flavor or you create new flavor with it. But the other thing that happens in dry aging is you lose moisture in it, and so you get evaporative loss. You also have extra trimming that must occur, especially if you look at the picture on the right where we have that primal, the strip primal there. You'll end up getting a lot more trim loss that occurs on that because you have to take off that exterior and that dried surface that goes with it. And so it is one opportunity that smaller processors tend to have over maybe the larger processors. At a large processor, the primals, especially the middle meats, will get aged, but they're just done in a vacuum pouch, and so that's called wet aging, and a similar mechanism that happens, just a slightly different product that comes out with it. So the other thing that you can get with is grading of product. And this is something that only can occur in USDA inspected products. So if you go to a custom processor where you're buying that quarter beef, this isn't something they can have done. But if it is an inspected facility, there's the option to have carcasses graded with this. There's a new remote grading system that USDA has rolled out that has enabled smaller processors to be able to get quality grades assigned to the beef carcasses. One of the things it really allows you to do is having an opportunity to market your products in this way. And so when we look at it, what percentage of the beef supply is out there? This is one of the things that's interesting is it's actually shifted towards the higher end of the quality quite a bit over the last years. And so a decade ago, we were talking about a third that were select and about 3% that were in prime. The latest numbers I saw, I think we're at like 12% prime now, and we might be closer to about 15% select. But really what this allows you to do is having a marketing claim with it. The biggest difference in it is related to how much marbling is in it, or the intramuscular fat. And really what this data and what the research shows is if you have a higher grade, you have a greater likelihood of a positive eating experience than if you have a lower grade. And that's really what it's related to. And so it gives you an opportunity to potentially market a product at a premium when you get into the choice and prime. So one of the things that I want to mention on all of these that we have is it really gives a lot of options for the customers. And sometimes it can seem overwhelming, but one of the great things about it is it gives you opportunities, and there's different price points and different characteristics that each customer is really puts priority on, and it gives the options for them to do it. It doesn't mean that one production method is better than the other or other claims are necessarily better than the others, but it really gives that opportunity to let the customer choose what they want to purchase with it. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go through it. So one of the things when we talk about buying more in bulk, what happens is you will work with a small processor and a local producer, or maybe you raise an animal yourself and you get that processed and bring that meat back home to your for your own consumption. And there's always a lot of misunderstanding or lack of understanding of how much meat you actually get from a carcass. And the examples that we're going to work through are on a 1,200-pound carcass, and these are a decade ago might have been about the average. Now we're probably about 1,400 pounds. So we may get a little bit more proportionally than what's shown on here. But if we think of it, we have different weights that go with it. And so in this example, a 1,200-pound carcass, we're going to first go through the harvest process where the internal organs, the head, the blood, the hide are all removed. And that will take us from a live weight to a carcass weight. And that really, that conversion is what we can call the dressing percentage. So when we're working in beef in this example, we're going to typically have somewhere between about a 60 to a 63% dressing percentage. It might be a little bit lower if we work with dairy cattle that are a little bit lighter muscled. It might be a little higher if we have a heavy muscled or something that's really fat. We'll get more that hangs on that carcass. And so from that, we end up with a carcass in this case that is going to be about 750 pounds, I think is what a 1,200-pound carcass is on there. Just and then the other part with that is after we go through the cutting process, we lose additional fat, we lose additional bone that goes with it, and that gets us down to what we actually get to take home. And so depending upon how you get the product cut, it will affect how much you have. And so if it's completely boneless, you may be closer to 450 pounds of product. If you get cuts like T-bones and roasts that have bone included in it, you may be closer in this case to like 520 pounds. I think if we're looking at the 1,400-pound carcass that we have now, we may be closer to 550 to 600 pounds that you would be taking home from a carcass. So one of the things to put that into perspective is how much does it take to actually get that home? And so if you think of a typical cooler that you use that may be 50 to 60 quarts, kind of that standard size cooler we think of, it might be 5 to 7 coolers of meat that we take home on a beef carcass. If we're working with pork, an average pig today, you probably take home about 140 to 160 pounds of meat with that. And so that might be 2 coolers full with that. And if we're working with lambs, it might be somewhere between about 35 to 55 pounds that are with it. And so it really is going to vary from species that we have, that amount that we get in the dressing percentage, and then the trimming that takes place along with it. And so it will vary that we have with it. One thing to note on the beef is you will get about 40 to 50% of that back as ground beef. It will vary based on how many roasts that you have, but you do get a lot of ground beef that comes back on that. In pork, we have a little bit less because we also use the belly to make bacon. And so we have a little bit of less of that going into sausage. We also tend to keep Boston butts for sauce or for smoking and things like that. And so the cuts that you choose to have made are going to impact what your makeup of that carcass is as we go through it. And so when we think about it, on a beef carcass, it's going to vary kind of based on how much it is. And you look at the size of that animal. And so if we think of a loin, we're going to have somewhere about 12 to 14 inches of that. And so that's going to give us about 14 T-bone steaks. Now, if we don't want to get T-bone steaks, we could get strip steaks and we could get tenderloin fillets that go with it, but you can't have both T-bones and tenderloins that go with it. Similarly, we're going to end up with about the same amount of rib steaks or rib eye steaks if they take it off the bone. The sirloin steaks are going to be somewhere around 8. We're going to get some other roasts that go in there. And it really is this is going to be dependent upon what your makeup is as we go through it. When we think of a hog, we're going to end up with pork chops. So in that, you think of kind of the length of the back of the pig, we're probably going to end up with somewhere about 12 to 14 pounds of pork chops. It'll depend if it's bone in or boneless that's with it. And that's probably somewhere about 18 pork chops, I would guess, on it. We're going to get 2 spare, or we're going to get one spare rib with it. That'll be with it. They may cut it into 2 packages depending upon how you want it, if you want it as a full rack or a half rack. If you do a boneless pork chop, you may get back ribs. Otherwise, those will be included in your pork chop that goes with it. You'll get 2 shoulder roasts or 1 whole butt that goes with it. You may get, if you want, you can get an arm roast. Otherwise, those will end up going into sausage production that's with it. You can have your ham, which is either going to be a half ham or a whole ham, or you can have center cut steaks plus ham roasts that are with it. And if it's cured, and probably somewhere about 8 to 12 pounds of bacon that goes along with it. And so these are all things that you choose as you go through it and what you pick with it. And so one of the things with these processors, as you go look at it, is they're going to have different options that they have. Some are going to be standard cuts. They have other times that they might provide a premium product that goes with it. And so on the example of your beef, if you want a cube steak made out of some of the round, there may be an extra fee for getting that cube steak prepared. Or if you want to have patties made, maybe there's an extra fee that goes along with it. If you want to have flat iron steaks, it takes a little bit more time to cut that than into arm roasts. And so there can be what sometimes processors refer to as the premium cuts that go along with it. And that gives you that and that will give you kind of an idea of what that cost may go along with it. On the sausage or the pork side, extra costs typically are related to the curing of the bacon and the ham. And so if you want that cured and smoked product, there's an added fee that goes along with that. You also may have a fee that goes along with the sausage related to the processing and the ingredients that go along with it. So we mentioned a little bit of this before on that, but it kind of just covers a few of those things again. We'll skip on then to the, so one thing on this, if we think about it, how you pay for the animal makes a difference on it. And so you may pay based on the live weight of the animal. You may pay on the hot carcass weight of the animal that's associated with it. But as you work your way through it, it's going to come down to really what you're concerned about is what does it take for you to bring it when you bring it home. And so if the price is in this case for a 660 pound hot carcass weight, if you paid $4.15 per pound on the hot carcass weight basis, from that, you're going to get 430 pounds of meat. And that would give you a take home price of everything: steaks, roasts, short ribs, ground beef at $6.38 per pound. And so that's important to keep in mind, that hot carcass weight, again, doesn't translate to what you're bringing home. And you have to count that in as you go through your process costs.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about pricing. So when we think about, Gary was talking about just how much we're going to pay per pound. Generally, the number one thing that we kind of run into is when they give you that price, okay, it's going to be 400 and or it's going to be $4.15 for a hot carcass. You times that by $660, you're going to be stuck with a pretty large check there, right? You know, something a little over $2,000 or over $2,000. And so the biggest thing that the question that we get is, well, how much meat do I actually need, or how fast am I going to go through this? And so this is information that the USDA kind of puts out, and this looks at essentially how much meat does an average adult eat in the United States. And so the different colors represent the different meat products. So we got beef, pork, chicken, turkey, and this is per capita on the retail weight, so not boneless. So an average person an average adult in the US eats about 105 pounds of chicken, 50 pounds of pork, 55 pounds of beef, and 14 pounds of turkey. So then you think about food waste plus any kids you might have. And so when you think about how much meat do I need for an entire year if I were to eat my normal consumption, we just think about the number of adults times this meat quantity. So if you have just you and another person in that, you essentially would take 210 pounds of chicken, 100 pounds of pork, 110 pounds of beef, and 28 pounds of turkey. So it's actually quite a bit of meat that we actually eat throughout the entire year. And so when we think about, well, how much do I actually then spend on that meat? What we find is the USDA also reports this, that we spend per adult, we spend about $460 on beef, 243 pounds of chicken, 240 pounds on pork, or about $744 per person per year. So that's, you think about the number of adults in your house, and then we start to think about, okay, how much of that animal do I actually want? So if we think about total beef, Gary was saying, okay, we're gonna have 400 or 480 pounds for an entire beef. If we harvest one head of beef. Well, if we're only thinking I only want half of that animal, then we kind of go back from there, and then we probably have something like 200 pounds. Maybe we have 3 adults in the house, or 2 adults and 3 hungry teenagers. Then you're probably going to go through that, and that half or a full beef a year. So it's actually more than we actually think is kind of the main point there. And then we generally know that meat consumptions tends to be what we call highly associated with how much money we have. So if we have more money, we tend to eat more meat, and we tend to generally eat more beef, and then we tend to kind of split the rest between pork and chicken. So if you think about what is my disposable income, so after I pay taxes and all this stuff, the money that's kind of left over, if I look at that paycheck and I times that by about 2%, or if you want to think about total meat consumption times 4%, that's how much money you probably spend on meat per year. So when you're thinking about, do I want to actually fill my freezer? And then you start talking to a producer and saying, this is what it's going to cost. And you're like, oh, wow, that's pretty expensive. If you've kind of done some of these back calculations yourself, you're like, yeah, that's about how much I'm going to spend. What's the difference? It's one, I have to spend it throughout the entire year, and one, I actually have to come up with that money at one time. So how do we know, or how do we even compare prices that maybe we're seeing? Maybe we talk to one person and they say it's going to be $6.50 a pound. We talk to another person and they say it's going to be $9 a pound. So how do we actually compare these prices? What's some good data points that we can look at? I've kind of highlighted 3. This doesn't mean that this is the only places that you can get this information, but think about, just like, if we're all consumers and we generally buy meat, some of us are more sensitive to that price, but think about just like going to a grocery store like Hy-Vee or Aldi or Super Savers or Russ's, wherever you shop. And there's different meat products out there, and just kind of looking, oh, what's that price per pound for that flank steak, or that ribeye, or that pork chop, or that chicken breast. Sometimes depending upon where you buy in the product, it might be $2.40, it might be $1.99, it might be $3.50. Then we can think about just like farmers markets. You can just walk around farmers markets, talk to different producers and say, okay, what products do you have? Do you sell the entire animal? Do you sell individual cuts? And just kind of get an idea of what they're selling for. And the third one is USDA. The USDA actually gathers quite a bit of information nationally and within regions across all retailers. So if you're looking for, like, okay, this is an average within my area or across these different products that I may not have good data points for, the USDA reports that. And I put the link down there, and then we'll be sharing these slides afterwards, and you can go and click on them. But the one on the left, or actually the one on the right, is the regional report. So if we're thinking about, we're in the Midwest, and we think about the different quality of meat that we're maybe thinking about. So for instance, this bone-in ribeye steak, for a choice product, remember, think of what Gary was talking about, the meat quality. It's select, choice, prime being kind of the highest quality for intermuscular fat. The price ranged from about $9 to about $13.99 per pound. This is across 90 different stores, and the average price was about $11.50. So if you're thinking, you're trying to shop around and saying, is it more expensive? Is it not? You can actually think about the typical products that you like to buy or that you like to cook with. And you can go here to this USDA report and say, okay, what is this actual price? Is it within a reasonable range? Now, what kind of gets a little bit tricky is that these are generally for, I'd say, non-labeled products. Now, on this left-hand side is the new report that have started to release, and they will actually have started to separate out what is kind of just the conventional product that you would just buy without any labels with these different kind of labeled products. And so if you look here, we have a brisket or and we can think about a regular brisket, a brisket that's flat, that's grass-fed, right, antibiotic-free. That price was about $11.99 a pound. This is a national price. And then we think about a brisket flat regular, conventional, and it was about $9.99 a pound. So what do we know? This antibiotic-free grass-fed for this individual product is about $2. $2 premium to buy an antibiotic-free grass-fed. So you can use this if you're working with consume or producers and you're trying to figure out different prices and kind of, is this within a range, yes or no, and kind of give you some more data points there. So this is just some beef prices. If you were to go around and collect this type of information, kind of compare it, what you tend to find is that farmers markets are actually pretty competitively priced with where we're at on the retail side. And in some cases, some producers actually will charge less than what you could actually get it for at retail. So if we think about just kind of, we take that animal, and Gary kind of went through how much it costs. This is kind of just works through this a different example. This is provided by in our local food guide here at University of Nebraska on the Buy Fresh, Buy Local. But what I wanted to point out was that when we're talking about a price, generally there's a price for the animal, and generally there's a price for processing. So the cost of the animal, that goes to the producer, the person who's selling you the animal. And if sometimes those are separated and you actually have to pay the processor for the processor to cut the actual meat, to harvest the animal and to cut the meat. So when you're buying and it says it's $5.50 a pound, you have to ask the question of what's included in that price. Is this the cost for the animal? And then I have to pay an additional cost to get the animal processed, maybe like $1.50 per pound? Or is that $6.50 encompassing of the animal that I'm going to pay for and the processing fee? So different producers would do it different ways as when they sell the entire animal. Some include both the costs, some of them include just one of the costs, and they make you figure out the cost with the processor. And there's a lot of reasons for that. If you remember what Gary said, depending upon the type of meat and how you want it cut, sometimes there's no extra charge, and sometimes there is an extra charge. So that's why sometimes producers will separate out, you pay me this cost of the animal, and then you settle up with the processor. So let's talk about buying local meat, right? So if you want individual cuts, you're like, as Gary kind of went through, he says, you're going to get a lot of ground beef. If you just want to eat ribeyes, and you're not going to get, 450 pounds of ribeyes off of one beef. You're going to get a combination of lots of animals. So if you only want to eat ribeyes, that's okay. No judgment there. But buying in bulk from a local producer is probably not the best bet. So if you want to still have a connection and support local producers, then going to a farmer's market and finding producers that sell individual cuts is probably your best. And as Gary mentioned, all of those have to be processed at what we call USDA inspected facilities. Now, if you're thinking about, I'm okay having all sorts of cuts, then we think about you can buy meat in bulk, and those can be at what we call custom exempt plants, or they don't have federal inspection. And so the primary difference between USDA inspected is what you can do with the meat after it's been harvested. So USDA inspected means you can sell the individual cuts, and it can be sold within Nebraska and across state lines. Custom exempt is there's no federal inspection, and you actually have to own the animal prior to harvest. And once the meat's been harvested, you can't sell that meat. So that's why if they say, do you want to buy half a beef or a quarter beef? Essentially what that producer does is if you buy a quarter beef, they have to go and find people to buy the other 3/4 of the beef. And then they put all of those quarters or halves together. And so you technically own the animal when it's harvested. Gary?
Yeah, so that's correct on it. The big thing you'll see is not for sale stamped on all the custom exempt products. And so that's important to thing on it. I know during COVID, we'd see a lot of Facebook ads that says, we're selling freezer beef, or we're selling ground beef by the pound. And you'd see it stamped with not for sale. And it always made me cringe a little bit when seeing that. So make sure if you're doing this, you follow the rules we don't want you to get in trouble with that from what products can be sold and what can't. So when you go through it, it's important to do this. One of the things that helps is to get a relationship with your local meat processor that would be doing it. If you don't know a livestock producer, they may be able to help get you in touch with that, because they do have producers that bring in products on a regular basis, and they kind of have an idea of who may have products that are available. And so reaching out to either the livestock producer who may have a relationship with a meat processor, or a meat processor that may have a relationship with the livestock producer, is really what you'll find. And so you'll get that identified. They'll tell you when that animal is going to be ready and scheduled. And then when that happens, you need to tell them how you want the product cut. And that's really what the cut sheet is. And it's really the recipe card of what it is. And so when the processor has that carcass that they're going to fabricate into the cuts, they know what they have to make off of it and what cuts are made and saved back. And so they want to make sure that you get what you want, and how you're going to use it. And so if you use a lot of roasts, great. If you use a lot more ground beef, maybe some of those roasts get turned into ground beef that goes along with that. But anyways, that animal will go to harvest after the processing time or the hanging time that will happen in the cooler. That meat will be ready to be picked up. One of the things to keep in mind, if you are working with a processor, they only have so much freezer space. And so having that picking up when it's supposed to be done is really important to allow them to continue to process and meet their customer needs. And so that's something I just always want to point out, is freezer space is always limited as it's with it. So when do you pay? It really, as Elliott mentioned, it's going to vary how it's done. Sometimes the livestock producer will get paid and the processor gets paid separately. Sometimes they work together where they'll collect one payment and then separate that out. But really the key thing that has to happen is that ownership of that animal has to occur at the time the animal is dropped off, if it's a custom exempt plant, to be able to follow the regulations. And so it's really going to vary. This is where you talk to your local producer and your local processor on how they handle it, and work with them to follow their routes for it.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, sometimes before the animal is being raised, sometimes producers want a deposit or kind of some upfront costs to help offset some of their feeding stuff as well. So where do you find kind of this livestock producers? As Gary mentioned, if you don't know, and you could contact a meat processor, and a lot of times they know. But some other ways, if you're just thinking like, hey, I just want to kind of browse around, peruse, talk to individuals, the farmers market's always a great place to go. But it's not the only place where we find local producers. There's a lot of high quality people who sell beef and pork in Nebraska that don't necessarily have a farmers market presence in Lincoln or Omaha. And so one of the ways that they kind of reach out to producers is kind of getting involved with the Buy Fresh, Buy Local program here at the University of Nebraska. We produce this local food guide. It kind of gives you a map of all the local foods that you could purchase, not just necessarily livestock and poultry products. Talking to a friend, sometimes just kind of asking around, at work or people you interact with, like, hey, I'm looking for half a beef or a half a pork, you know, do you know where I can find something like this? And oftentimes someone knows a friend who knows a friend who you can talk to. Um, the other one is Facebook Marketplace, or if you're on different like groups, like I know there's like a Nebraska local foods group on Facebook and farmers market group. So oftentimes, if you're following those groups, the producer will post like, "Hey, I have a half a beef that's gonna, and I'm selling, 4 beef that are going to be harvested this day. Let me know if you're interested." And people would generally, the number one comment is, how much is it, right? And they will always send you a private message. Don't expect them to post the price in. So, but at least it starts the conversation. The other one is if you're not in Nebraska, or let's say you're trying to find local foods in other locations, or you find this to be really helpful and you tell friends or family that live out of state, the National Sustainability or Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has different kind of resources and guides by state. And so if you go on there and just type in local food directory, it will pull up by the different states. And then within Nebraska, our Department of Agriculture does actually have a food and meat directory for kind of local producers. And so that's also another place. The point is there's lots of places. And the first person you meet doesn't necessarily have the person that you have to buy from. And there's a difference, I'd say, Gary, right, between the producer producing a quality product and the meat processor cutting it properly. And so sometimes that has to be that right combination. You got to find the producer that you're comfortable with, and they have to be working with a processor who does a good job actually cutting the meat product. So as Gary mentioned, on the right-hand side, it's just kind of like a freezer full of meat. Like you got to have the space, right? So if we're thinking about just buying the product, it sounds great, but we have to have either a deep freezer where we can kind of work through that product throughout the year. So just the quantity and the logistics of picking that up and getting all the meat and getting your freezers, you're probably borrowing a whole bunch of tub freezers from everyone just to haul the meat from wherever you're from the meat processing plant back to your house. And then kind of the big one that kind of Gary mentioned is just being familiar with all the cuts. Maybe these are cuts that you haven't cooked with in the past, and maybe you want to try them out. Maybe this is the time, or maybe you just kind of grind them up into ground beef. And probably the biggest thing that we get all the time is just kind of the upfront money. The difference between kind of buying, even though it could be cheaper to buy from local producers, it's just you got to come up with all that money up front to pay. So there are different ways and that you can do that, but generally that tends to be a pretty big deterrent. Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of the difference in small meat processors, how they work? So we talked a lot about the producer or the livestock producer. What about this small meat processor? What can they expect with that relationship?
Yeah, so in the small meat processors, it's really a different setup than the larger production. The large processors, if you see on the picture on the right, this is going to be working on the boxed pork and beef and products that are going to be entering food service and grocery stores, and they fill a lot of the U.S. meat needs. And so it is a more commercialized process where the smaller plants tend to be serving that local environment more so. A lot of the meat that's processed at them is specifically for customers, like we've been talking in this, either to be sold by the cut if it's inspected, or by the quarter or half or whole animal that goes along with it. And so both have the same regulatory requirements from safety, from animal handling, and setups like that. And so first of all, any food processor is going to make sure that they make a safe food product, a safe and wholesome product. And that's part of what USDA inspection oversees, and applies that rules similarly to both plants, both sides of operations. And so the other part is, what cuts are you going to use? And so one of the things that you think about is we kind of default towards what we're comfortable with, and you tend to use a few other cuts. One of the things that happens with it, especially in the beef side, is you get quite a variety of cuts that go along with it. And so knowing what to do with each of those cuts does make a difference on it and how you can best do it. And so, for example, you might get some beef shanks, which are delicious when prepared properly, but if you make them improperly, they're going to be tough. That goes along with it. And so one of the things that causes you to do is become a little bit more creative in your cooking that goes with it. Or if you don't want to do that, you can also cut the meat off those shanks and put it into ground beef production. And so that's one of the things that when you go through your cut sheet, you get to pick out what you're going to use and what you're not. And if you do this multiple times, you'll get to the point where you know what cuts and what combination of cuts works best for you as you go through it. But that reference is really helpful thinking through it. The beef it's what we eat website, or beef it's what's for dinner website, has a lot of good information for it. Pork board has similar things that would be on the pork side as well. So this is really the cut sheet that we've mentioned a couple times, but this is that recipe or that blueprint that you go through that tells you what it is. And so it says, what cuts do you want from the different areas? And so if you're working with the beef, you work on the chuck. Do you want chuck roast? Do you want 7-bone roasts? Do you want flat irons? And you have to identify what's done with it, because you can only have a certain combination of cuts that happen. Because if you choose one, then you can't do some of the others. It'll also give you options on how big you want that cut. And so if you're a family of 2, you might only want a 2-pound roast, where if you're a family of 6, you might want a 4-pound roast. And so you get a chance to kind of give a weight size as well as packaging information. When it comes to the steaks and chops, you'll get an opportunity to tell them how thick of cuts you want. The processor will say, here's as small as a cut as I do, and here's as big as a cut as I do. It'll also have how many do you want packaged in that. And so if you're, again, a family of 2, maybe you want 2 steaks in it. If you're a family of 4, maybe you opt to have 4 that goes in it. And so you get that opportunity to pick through those as you go work through it. And so those are really the 2 main things, but then we also have all the other cuts that go with it. Do you want to save the short ribs back, or do you want those boned out? Do you want to save the variety meats, or do you want to have those disposed of? Do you want to have the fat saved back that you might use for venison processing, or if you want to render lard or tallow? Those are all options that you get to go through and choose as you're picking on it. When we get into the pork side, we will have the curing that goes along with it as well. And so that's really where you can give some of those options that go with it. So that's part of what you need to think through as you're filling out your cut sheet, is what you want it to include.
Yeah, and then I just add to that, right, Gary, that the producer that you're buying from can help you fill this out, and the small processor where it's getting processed can also kind of help you kind of sort through that. So don't feel like you don't understand a lot of this stuff, that you got to do that by yourself. They're there to help, and they want to have you have a good experience.
Yeah, both the producer and the processor, that's their goal, is they want you to come back. And if you don't like what you get, they're not going to. So one last thing is differences in packaging option. One of the things we've seen the small processors really move from is, typically it was a butcher paper overwrap or butcher paper wrapping. And so if you look at the lower right hand corner, we do see that. There's a few places that do that, but most places have gone into what we have in the upper right corner that is in a vacuum package. Either it's in this or in a continuous filling line that is doing it. But one of the things is with the vacuum packaging is we get a lot better meat quality and shelf life with it. And so you're less likely to get freezer burn and off flavors that are associated with it. And so most plants now have that option for vacuum packaging, and that really gives you a much better product. The picture on the left, you can see that's that overwrap tray that you buy from the grocery store and put in your freezer, and you can see the amount of ice crystals that come with it, some freezer burn that happens with it, and discoloration. And so that's really probably the least ideal option we have, but most plants are now going to vacuum packaging. And so if you get the chance to have that, that's really what I would recommend. And if there is an added cost with it, it's worth it.
And Gary, typically for help them, how long can meat actually sit in the freezer by these different methods?
Yeah, so part of it's going to depend on the freezer you have. The worst freezer is the one that's above your refrigerator, because that temperature is going to fluctuate a lot more as it's trying to keep the temperature of the refrigerator consistent. If you have a deep freeze, it'll last longer than it will for a that refrigerator freezer. But if we are looking at um, if we're looking at the paper wrap, we're probably wanting to use things 6 months, maybe 9 months in that. If we're in a vacuum package, we should have 12 months or maybe even longer with it. It really is going to depend a bit on those conditions that you store it, but you definitely get an increase in shelf life with that vacuum pouch versus a paper wrap.
Great. So really, our kind of goal today was to kind of take you through kind of that whole process and really kind of highlight that there are small meat processors here in Nebraska, and a lot of producers who are trying to sell local to consumers. And really it allows kind of this relation to be formed. You can figure out the type of operation that you kind of want to support or that you believe meat, could come from. And I think there's some local community benefits that are kind of touted, have the potential to save money. You have the opportunity to support kind of operations that you really want to advocate. And really kind of the big thing that a lot of people say when they go with small producers is they feel like they can, quote, taste the difference. And I think a lot of that difference is coming from just the ability to have kind of these more nuanced. If we think about just like a tomato, right? A tomato that you're going to buy in the store, you can grow a lot of different varieties in kind of the local market that you may not, if you're thinking about a large retailer that has to kind of service many stores. So there is some differences in that, and just kind of the variety and the quality that you can receive. And the last is, if you're interested, you can contact us. We mentioned a lot of places that you can talk to producers, but talk to farmers. They always love advocating about the product. They love talking about their product. It's kind of like the two things that that they love talking about: their kids, and the product they produce. And so if you have questions, just let them know. And with that, we'll just take any questions. I know some of these were coming through, so when we kind of get to them, if you do have questions, put them in the chat box and we will get to them. And all the slides will be provided, and a recording of this webinar will also be available as well. So Gary, there was one here about the freezer life of meat. So we answered that. Maybe you can highlight a little bit about remote grading.
Yeah, so with the remote grading, this is a process that USDA has now come out with. And so with the grading process, what it required at other or previously is a USDA grader to be at your plant to view the carcasses. And it really became cost prohibitive to have small processors do that. So with the remote grading process, really what happens is the small processors set up a standard operating procedure of how they do it, but ultimately they will take pictures of the ribeye, the rib face, where it gets graded and that will get sent into the USDA, and that's really where the USDA grader then will look at that image and provide the grade, and then they'll send back what grade it is so that carcass can be identified and then would be able to be marketed as that grade going forward. Now, prior to this, what you would see processors do or small producers do is they would just, instead of selling a grade, they would just have their own branded product, and it would be Dennis Farms beef, and they would say about how it's produced and things like that, and just wouldn't make the claim of what grade it was. This just allows maybe another level of marketing that goes along with it.
Yeah, I'd say that there's also a lot of differences as well, just kind of what you're able to provide. So just sometimes you can go to a small meat processor and they may not be USDA inspected, but they still are selling meat at like a retail counter. And the difference is that they're buying in USDA inspected meat and then cutting it up and selling it. So if you've been to a small meat processor and they have what's called like a retail storefront, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the meat that's being processed at that facility. Just means that they're selling a product that they feel comfortable with and are willing to cut meat. So some differences there. You can be custom exempt and sell meat in bulk, and also have like a retail storefront, which you see a lot in kind of more rural communities as well. Any other questions? I know if you look in the Q&A box, we had some questions about kind of what happens with the fat or tallow. We call that kind of render. So, I mean, a lot of the blood or the organs, or we call it kind of variety of meats is sometimes what they're referred to, is you have the option for the most of the time you have the option to take those products if that's something you're interested in. If not, if you look in actually one of the slides, we actually have kind of a render cost for taking that product and disposing of it. So sometimes there is that additional cost if you don't take those. And that's just because the processor basically has to put it into a landfill. Larger meat processors are able to, because they do so much volume, have a lot of product. Think of like 5,000 beef tongues, and they're able to kind of put that into a bundle and sell that elsewhere. Any other questions you have, or just thoughts that you're thinking of?
So Dwayne, you had a question on it. So if you go, USDA FSIS has a list of USDA inspected facilities that you can look up and see that. You wouldn't necessarily need to ask for their certification, but if they say they're USDA inspected, it is going to be that way. They would have a certificate or grant of inspection that allows them to do that. The other thing with that is any inspected product, there will be a little USDA inspection legend that goes with it. And in that we'll have an establishment number. So each facility has a unique number. Here on campus, we have the Leffel Meat Laboratory, and our inspection establishment number is 5658. And so each facility, each operation would have that. But that inspection legend is required then for selling the products. You could ask about getting a tour of the plant. They may be able to provide it. They may not. It depends on how busy they are at the time and what else is going on. But that would be something to ask the processor.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Dwayne, I'm putting in that directory that Gary was talking about. You can actually go and look for the state and the type of processing that you want, and it will actually pull it up. And you'll be able to see all the contact information for those. If you're interested in a local or like a custom exempt, you can contact us, and we're happy to provide a list for you of people that would be in the area that custom exempt. That's the people that are basically selling in bulk. Any other questions that you have? Okay, if not, just feel free to contact Gary or myself. Our information will be provided. And I want to thank you for joining us today. Look for the recording that will be sent to you in the next 24 hours. It will also be in our archive session at the Center for Agriculture Profitability webinar, which is cap.unl.edu/webinars. And when you close your Zoom meeting, you'll see a short survey. We really appreciate your feedback on this. This helps us kind of provide new information. And if you can complete it, just a few very questions, it's really valued. But once again, thanks for joining us, and hope to see you at another webinar at cap.unl.edu. Have a great day, everyone.
Hey, thanks. As you were closing out there, Elliott, there was one more question that came in from Dwayne. If you want to tackle that, either of you.
Is it in the chat box?
Yeah.
So the question was, how do you ensure that they're processing the beef you bring in? And I've worked with lots of these small processors, and they're generally respectable people, and they're going to be processing what you produce. If you have questions about it, ask it, but they're not going to be having less steaks or taking steaks or be switching around animals or things like that. if they did, they're not going to have a business that stays in process because they're really working for the customers. And if they're not providing the service that the people need, they're going to look elsewhere. And so uh, they have a process of how they track that animal, and you could ask them how they do that, but each place has their own process for it, but they're going to make sure that you get back what you take in.
All right. Well, thank you both, Gary and Elliott, and thank you everybody for attending today. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Hey, everyone.